After launching the Peace Corps, John F. Kennedy cautioned potential volunteers, "If the life will not be easy, it will be rich and satisfying. For every young American who participates in the Peace Corps will know that he or she is sharing in the great common task of bringing to man the decent way of life, which is the foundation of freedom and a condition of peace." Chic Damback was one American who answered that challenge, a challenge that began a lifetime commitment to peace. Chic Damback is now President Emeritus of the National Peace Corps Association and former president of the Alliance for Peacebuilding. He's returning a second year to Global Peace Education Day.
Thank you very much, Michael, for those kind comments. I really appreciate it. And it's a pleasure to be a part of this activity and this event. Anything that gets people thinking about and active in and doing what we can to help make the world more peaceful is something I'm proud of and want to be a part of. So I really appreciate very much this opportunity. I've been asked to share a story about an opportunity that I had several years ago to be directly involved in helping bring about a peaceful resolution to a dreadfully violent conflict, and to share some of my observations about the things that are most important for helping build a much more peaceful world. The story is about East Africa, Ethiopia and Eritrea, which followed the news over a period of time. A dreadful border war broke out between Ethiopia and Eritrea about 20 years ago. And a friend of mine who had been a Peace Corps volunteer in Ethiopia by the name of John Garamendi gave me a call. And he said, "Chick, my friends are killing each other and we've got to do something about it." And he was talking about the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea, where John and his wife, Patty, had served as Peace Corps volunteers. I had just finished several years as head of the National Peace Corps Association, and John and I had become friends. And so he wanted to see what we could do about that terrible war, Ethiopia and Eritrea. We were both private citizens. John is a fairly significant politician. He's a member of Congress right now. And then it had a sub-cabinet position in the Clinton administration, but was private citizen at the time. I was too. So you kind of wonder, what can we do as private citizens? But both of us had served in the Peace Corps. The heads of state of the two countries had been taught by Peace Corps volunteers. Their foreign ministers and ambassadors had all been taught by Peace Corps volunteers. So they had a respect for the Peace Corps and people who had served in the Peace Corps. So John and I got together and we talked about it and decided we would get in touch with the embassies and let them know we'd be interested in helping out if they wanted us to. We weren't going to impose ourselves. We couldn't impose ourselves. But if they wanted us to play a role, we said we would be happy to do what we can to try to help bring about a peaceful resolution. And they said, "Please help. We've gotten into a terrible situation and we can't figure out how to get out of it. And we trust you because you have that Peace Corps background, and we know that you'll do the best you can to help us find a way to resolve this." So it took 2 years, back and forth. We went over, we were invited to meet with the heads of state in Asmara and in Addis Ababa, working our way through the factors that caused them to be at war. They were killing 100,000 people over a small strip of land on the border between these two countries. Of course, my position was the border should not be determined on the basis of who can kill more of the other side's people. What an absolutely absurd way to settle a difference like that. But it had developed and was raging on. So we met with the leaders on both sides. We also met with the business leaders and the religious leaders and civil society to build a base of support for a peace agreement. And at the end of the day, they did come to an agreement, and they had reached the point of one final step that one side or the other was going to have to make a concession. And by the way, something I learned at that particular point was the importance of pride. We look at financial factors and military factors and so on. Pride is tremendously important in these conflict environments and in reaching settlements. And to reach a settlement, you've got to find a way of preserving the pride of both sides. And in this case, we were down to one last factor. One side or the other was going to have to make a concession. And it would be hard on their pride to be the one to do that. But we were able to position it in a way. In fact, John and I were on the phone with the president of Eritrea. And we were able to get him to see that if he were to challenge the other side, to accept what was needed for a peace agreement, it would challenge the other side to also accept it. So that gave him a point of pride that he could take, and he took it. He said, "I'll do it." And I jumped into a cab, zipped over to the Ethiopian embassy and said, "Let's go through this one more time. If Isaias is willing to accept this change in the modalities for implementing a ceasefire, the war is over. Is that right?" And they said, "Yes, it's over. But he'll never do it. All he wants to do is fight." I said, "Well, I understand what you're saying, but he just did." And it kind of looked at me like, "You got to be kidding." I said, "Absolutely." And I pulled out my cell phone and I said, "I've got him on speed dial." They said, "You can't do that." They wouldn't let me use my own phone to call and confirm that we had brought about an end to a war. But there was a prohibition of any communication between the countries. Much of their communication took place through us, through others as well. Of course, the UN was involved. African Union played a major role in bringing it about, but we were able to play a very significant role. So I said, I know the rules. I know what your position is, but please convey to the Prime Minister what I just told you. 2 weeks later, Prime Minister Melis was in the United States, and he asked to have breakfast with John, Mel Foote, and myself. And over breakfast, he leaned forward and said, "I want you to know the war is over, and I want to thank you for making it happen." And we just kind of rocked back in our chairs like, wow, it's actually happening. And we were just ecstatic over that news, and grateful for the acknowledgement from the Prime Minister of the role that we were able to play. We were invited to the treaty signing ceremony in Algiers, and we were there. Madeleine Albright was there, and of course, there were all of the other players that played a major role. We weren't the only ones. There were a lot of people that played a major role. But Madeleine Albright was there, and she expressed her gratitude for what we had done. We spent the entire evening with the president of Eritrea afterwards, talking about what could be done to implement the peace agreement. The whole next morning, we met with their foreign minister, Seo Mesfin, to talk about what Ethiopia could do to implement it. And we got a letter then from Ethiopia's prime minister thanking us for creating what he called the spirit and the momentum that made the peace agreement possible. We didn't negotiate the details of the agreement. We weren't in a position to do that. That's what the official diplomats do. But as citizens engaged and as advocates for the people who want to live in peace, that's what we were able to do. And by the way, an important factor that we as private citizens could bring to it that our government could not. The US government, which I respect, I admire, but it has to be looking out for US foreign policy interests, as does any other government involved in trying to reach a peace agreement. Our position was not to be advocating the US position or any other country's position, but simply advocating for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Peaceful resolution, regardless of who comes out ahead. Let's stop the killing. And that because we were able to take that position, we were able to create a spirit and a momentum that helped make it possible. The most gratifying thing of all to me in the aftermath of the being in Algiers for the signing of the agreement was I was in Washington, D.C. I was working in Washington, but I stopped at the corner of 18th and L at a kiosk that sells hot dogs. And I recognized that the lady in the kiosk was probably from the Horn of Africa, and I asked where she was from. And she proudly said she was from Eritrea. I said, "I thought so." I said, "I happen to know your president, Isaias Afwerki." She just kind of looked at me like, "Who's ever heard of our president?" And she said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm Chic Damback." And her eyes got big. A smile came on her face. She said, "I know you. I know who you are. You brought peace to my country." And she bounded out and gave me a big hug. And we've been dear friends ever since. But that meant so much to me that a private citizen from Eritrea had followed everything we had done. It was in the news. And she was so grateful for what we had done. And that's what it was all about, is bringing about a peaceful resolution so the people like Yeshu and her family and the other families would no longer be in fear of violence and death and destruction of their families and their homes and their communities. So that's just a story of my small role in bringing something about. But things like this are going on all the time. There are hundreds and hundreds of NGOs, non-government organizations working throughout the world to bring about peace. And one of the most exciting things to me is the organizations within the countries. In Kenya, for example, they just had an election that had the potential of turning violent. But the Kenyan citizen organizations made sure that people did not resort to violence in the aftermath of that election. That is private citizens building a peaceful environment, creating a culture that says, regardless of whether you like the outcome of the election, you'll accept it and not resort to violence. And that kind of thing is happening all over the world. Obviously, we see an awful lot of places where it isn't working. This happens to be a very difficult time with what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, and all too many other places that don't get the amount of attention that they get. But the fact of the matter is, in spite of all of that, the world is safer and more peaceful now than it has been in its history. You think back 50 years ago, you had the war in Vietnam, where a couple of millions of Vietnamese were killed in that war. Millions of Vietnamese. We don't think about that here, but that's a fact. In Cambodia, had hundreds of thousands of people. In Thailand, in China, you had dreadful things going on. You had the wars of liberation in throughout Africa. That was just 50 years ago. We're so much more peaceful now than we were then. You go back 100 years, and you've got the world wars, and you go back beyond that, and you see that violent conflict was predominant. That's just not the case anymore. Most of the world gets to live peacefully these days, and we're putting in place the systems and structures to make it possible to perpetuate and accentuate and increase the peacefulness of the people on this planet. There is a growing awareness throughout the world that you just don't get to use violent force to advance your cause and build empires. Used to be empire building was laudable. It was what you wanted to do. We lionized people who build empires. Now, if you try to build an empire, as Putin is trying to do, you are chastised for it. You're condemned for doing it. It is just no longer reasonable, rational, or acceptable to build empires through the use of violent force. That's a dramatic change in the attitudes of people throughout the world. We have put in place institutions to help make that happen. The United Nations, more than anybody else, has made a dramatic difference. The UN is there to, first and foremost, prevent violent conflict between nation states. For the last couple of decades, up until Putin came along, war between nation states had virtually ceased to exist. Virtually ceased to exist, war between nation states. Think about that. What a tremendous achievement. And as I say, until Putin came along, it had almost ceased to exist. And hoping that he is not successful, because assuming he is not successful, the further message to the whole world is you just don't get to do that and get away with it anymore. It is just not acceptable. Among the lessons that I learned in this process that helped us be successful was being able and willing to listen. John and I and our group, we didn't have a solution to it. We were there to work with them, help them find it. And by doing that, we could listen to both sides and understand and respect both sides and try to help them listen to and understand that the other side has a reason for doing what they're doing too. And that by achieving that, by achieving a level of listening and mutual respect, that is key to bringing about a peaceful resolution. So just one other point I want to make, and then I'll let you go. I've gone on way too long. But among the new developments that just came about about 12, 13 years ago, is the Institute for Economics and Peace and the Global Peace Index. We now have, for the first time in history, a ranking of the nations of the world based on their peacefulness. And the purpose of the Global Peace Index is not to know who's the most violent. We know who's the most violent. They're in the news. This is to find out who's the most peaceful and to find out what the peaceful countries are doing right so that everybody else can emulate them. The metaphor for this is if you wanted to be a marathon champion, wanted to win a gold medal in the Olympics for running the marathon, you wouldn't study those who never even qualified. You study those who won the gold medal. What are they doing right? And what we're able to do through the work of the Institute for Economics and Peace and Global Peace Index is identify the most peaceful countries and societies in the world and find out what is it about them. What are they doing right that makes it possible for them to be peaceful? And they've identified what we call pillars of peace, good governments, freedom of the press, good education systems, the factors like that are the common denominators of the most peaceful societies in the world. And that then provides a roadmap for everybody else to become more peaceful. And I get to have the privilege of being able to work with people all over the world to share this information, share these ideas, and help promote a spirit and a momentum that can make societies and eventually the whole world more peaceful. And with that, I've said too much, but that's my perspective on it all. And I, again, deeply appreciate the opportunity to speak out with you and to share this with people all over the world who will be seeing this. Thank you so very, very much.